They thought the owner was an absentee millionaire who wouldn't notice. So the HOA president decided to simply take his house. She filed the papers, changed the locks, and declared his multi-million-dollar mansion community property. But she never expected the owner to be a man who was already 2 steps ahead. You won't believe the trap he set for her. This property is no longer in compliance, therefore, it is no longer considered private. The statement was delivered with the flat, unassailable authority of a despot declaring a new law. It was aimed at Frank Miller, a man whose weathered face and perpetually tired eyes had seen almost everything in his 60 years, but had never seen anything quite like this. He stood on the limestone patio of the most magnificent house in Serenity Shores, a sprawling palace of glass and steel cantilevered over the California coast, and stared at the woman before him. Her name was Margaret Stillwater, and she was the newly elected president of the Serenity Shores Homeowners Association. She was dressed in what appeared to be her uniform of power, a severe black vest over a starched white shirt, punctuated by a blood-red tie pulled uncomfortably tight at her throat. Her face was a mask of pinched self-righteousness, her lips a thin, ungenerous line. In her hand, she held a clipboard, the modern-day scepter for petty tyrants everywhere. "I'm sorry, Margaret," Frank said, his voice raspy from the sea air in disbelief. "I must have misheard you. Did you say the house isn't private?" "That is correct," she affirmed, making a brisk check mark on her sheet. The Serenity Shores HOA board held an emergency vote last night. Pursuant to bylaw 17 section C, subsection 4, chronic noncompliance and aesthetic abandonment, we have voted to annex this property. It is now under the direct stewardship of the HOA. Frank felt a dizzying sense of unreality, as if the solid ground beneath his feet had suddenly turned to sand. "Annex Margaret. You can't annex a $12 million private residence. This house doesn't even fall under the original HOA charter map. Dr. Finch pays for community access as a courtesy." "A courtesy that has expired," she snapped. "Dr. Finch has not been seen on these premises for 18 months. The lawn, on 3 separate occasions, exceeded the regulated 3-inch height limit. The mailbox, an unapproved shade of pewter, was not replaced after the winter storms. The property has failed to be represented at the last 6 mandatory HOA meetings. It is, by all legal definitions, within our covenants. An abandoned and non-compliant parcel. We are absorbing it for the good of the community." Frank stared at her, the absurdity of it all crystallizing into a cold, hard knot of anger in his stomach. He was the property's caretaker, hired by its owner, Alistair Finch, a world-renowned historical anthropologist who was, indeed, not present. Dr. Finch was on a 2-year expedition in the Andes, excavating a pre-Incan settlement. He was a man who dealt in millennia. In the rise and fall of entire civilizations, he had little time for the micropolitics of a woman who wielded lawn-length regulations like a weapon. The truth was, the Serenity Shores HOA was broke. A series of bad investments by the previous board had drained their reserve funds. The manicured lawns, the private security, the pristine tennis courts, they were all running on fumes. Margaret Stillwater, elected on a platform of fiscal restoration, had identified the Azure Point House, as it was known, as her salvation. It was an island of immense wealth, technically existing outside the original HOA map, but situated right in the heart of their gated community. A geographic anomaly from a time before the HOA existed. She saw it not as a private home, but as an untapped resource, a rogue state that needed to be brought under her control. The lawn, the mailbox, they were nothing but pretexts, flimsy justifications for an audacious act of piracy. "You're out of your mind," Frank said, his voice low. "This is illegal. You can't just steal a man's house. It is not theft. It is an administrative reclamation." Margaret corrected him coolly. She took a step forward, producing a large, professionally printed sign from under her arm. The text was bold and aggressive. "This property is now under the management of the Serenity Shores HOA. No trespassing." She then pulled a small mallet from a loop on her belt. As of this moment, Miller, you are the one who is trespassing. I will give you 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and vacate the premises. After that, I will have the locks changed and the property secured. She marched past him onto the immaculate lawn, the one Frank himself had just mowed to a perfect 2.5 inches, and began to hammer the sign into the soft turf. Each thud of the mallet was an exclamation point on her declaration of war. Frank, his mind reeling, pulled out his satellite phone, the only reliable means of communication Dr. Finch had while deep in the mountains. He dialed the number, his hands shaking with a mixture of rage and adrenaline. After a series of beeps and a long, agonizing pause, the call connected. The voice on the other end was faint, crackling with static, but calm. Frank, is everything all right? No, Dr. Finch, it is not, Frank said, his words tumbling out. You're not going to believe this. Margaret Stillwater, the HOA president, she's here. She's claiming the HOA is annexing the house. She's putting up signs. She's threatening to change the locks. She says the house belongs to them now because you missed some meetings and the grass was too long. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence that seemed to stretch from the sun-drenched coast of California to the frigid peaks of the Andes. Frank expected an outburst, a string of curses, an order to call the police. Instead, what he heard was something far more chilling. Frank, Dr. Tyrant said, his voice suddenly crystal clear and devoid of any emotion. Does she have the annexation notice with her, the official document? Yes, she handed it to me. It looks official, stamped and signed by her and the board. Excellent, Ottersharp, Finch replied. The word was so unexpected that Frank faltered. And the sign, is she putting a sign on the lawn? She's hammering it in as we speak. Another pause. Then, Dr. Finch gave his instructions, his voice as precise and detached as if he were directing an archaeological dig. Good, do not call the police. Do not argue with her any further. Comply with her request. Pack a small bag and leave the house. Let her change the locks. Let her take possession. Sir, Frank whispered, horrified. You want me to just... Let her take your house, Frank, Dr. Finch said, and for the first time, Frank could detect a sliver of something sharp and dangerous beneath the calm. A predator is most vulnerable when it believes it has already killed its prey. Margaret Stillwater has just declared war on me based on a set of rules she wrote herself. She has no idea that I am a man who has spent his entire life studying the laws that govern empires, not garden gnomes. Let her have her small, temporary victory. Let her believe she has won. I want you to photograph everything, every document, every action. Record every conversation you can. You are no longer the caretaker. Frank, you are now the advanced scout for a counter-invasion. I will handle the rest from here. I'll be home sooner than I planned. Frank looked out at Margaret Stillwater, who was now standing back to admire her sign, her hands on her hips, a smug, triumphant look on her face. She looked like a conqueror planting her flag on a newly claimed territory. But Frank now saw her differently. He saw her as a creature that had just wandered into a perfectly designed trap, completely oblivious to the fact that the trap's owner was far older, far cleverer, and far more patient than she could possibly imagine. The battle for the Azure Point house had begun. But in a way, it had already been won. True to his word, Frank Miller packed a single duffel bag, his movements deliberately slow and methodical. He walked through the sunlit rooms of the Azure Point house one last time, his phone held discreetly at his side, its camera lens capturing the pristine state of the interior. He photographed the polished concrete floors, the floor-to-ceiling glass walls that framed the endless Pacific, the carefully curated collection of pre-Columbian artifacts displayed in museum-quality cases. He was no longer a caretaker. He was an archivist of a crime scene just before the violation. Margaret Stillwater stood on the patio, arms crossed, tapping her foot with theatrical impatience. When Frank finally emerged, pulling the heavy glass door shut behind him. She practically snatched the keys from his hand. "The locksmith will be here within the hour," she declared, her voice ringing with finality. "Do not attempt to return to these premises. You will be arrested for trespassing." Frank simply nodded, his face a mask of weary resignation. He walked down the long, winding driveway without looking back. But as soon as he reached the public road, he parked his old truck at a vantage point overlooking the property, took out a small pair of high-powered binoculars, and began his vigil. He watched as the locksmith van arrived. He watched as Margaret supervised the drilling of the locks Dr. Finch had commissioned from a security firm in Germany. He watched as she stood alone on the magnificent cantilevered deck, silhouetted against the setting sun. A tiny, dark figure who had just swallowed a star, entirely unaware it was about to go supernova in her stomach. The next 2 weeks were a study in the insidious creep of tyranny. Margaret Stillwater did not let her new prize lie fallow. Her first move was to hold the weekly HOA board meeting not in the stuffy, windowless community room at the gatehouse, but in Dr. Finch's grand living room. The board members, a motley crew of retired dentists and power-walking divorcees, sat awkwardly on the custom-designed Italian leather sofas, sipping cheap Chardonnay from Dr. Finch's hand-blown crystal glasses. "As you can see," Margaret announced, gesturing expansively at the breathtaking view, "the immediate annexation of this derelict property has already elevated the stature of our community. It is no longer an eyesore of noncompliance, but a functional asset." She laid out her grand vision. The Azure Point house would become the Serenity Shores Clubhouse and Event Center. The master bedroom suite would be her new permanent HOA office. The other rooms could be rented out for board-approved functions, weddings, corporate retreats, film shoots. The revenue, she promised, would not only stabilize their finances, but would allow them to lower their quarterly HOA dues. This announcement sent a schism through the small, wealthy community. For many, the promise of lower dues and access to the most exclusive property on the coast was intoxicating. They saw Margaret as a bold, effective leader. Why should one man, an absentee scholar no one ever saw, hoard such a paradise for himself? They readily embraced the narrative that Dr. Finch had abandoned his responsibilities and that the HOA was simply restoring order, but for a smaller, older contingent of residents. The move was horrifying. These were people who remembered Dr. Finch's parents, who had built the house long before the HOA was ever conceived. They remembered Alistair as a quiet, brilliant boy. They knew him not as a faceless millionaire, but as a neighbor to them. Margaret's actions were not administrative reclamation. They were a brazen theft, a violation of the very principles of property and privacy that their high walls were meant to protect. They muttered their dissent in private, but they were too intimidated by Margaret's iron-fisted control of the board to challenge her openly. From his rented beachfront apartment a half-mile down the coast, Frank Miller documented everything. He had become a ghost, an intelligence operative in a war only he and his commander knew was being waged. His telephoto lens captured the board meetings, the wine glasses, the smug expressions. He recorded the sound of Margaret outlining her monetization strategy as it carried across the water on a clear day. He photographed the "For Rent" sign that soon appeared next to the HOA's annexation notice, a smaller, tackier sign advertising the house for exclusive private events, with a booking number that routed directly to Margaret's personal cell phone. Each evening, he would upload his encrypted intelligence package to a secure server. The files were labeled simply Phase 1 Incursion and Occupation. He never received a direct reply, only a single, automated character that appeared in the server log after each upload. It was all the confirmation he needed. The counter-invasion was being planned with the same meticulous precision Dr. Finch applied to a forgotten civilization. The escalation Dr. Finch had predicted came 3 weeks after the initial takeover. An official-looking envelope from the Serenity Shores HOA financial office. A letterhead Margaret had designed herself and had printed at a local copy shop arrived at every home. It was the new quarterly dues assessment, as promised. It was 15% lower than the previous bill. In an accompanying letter, Margaret trumpeted her success. Thanks to the proactive fiscal management of your HOA board, she wrote, and the successful absorption of the formerly non-compliant property at One Azure Point, we have already secured new revenue streams that allow us to pass these savings on to you, our valued community members. This document was Margaret's fatal misstep. It was one thing to illegally trespass and change the locks. It was another entirely to commingle the fruits of that crime, the new revenue streams, with the HOA's legitimate finances. It was a clear-cut, undeniable case of conversion and unjust enrichment, documented and delivered by her own hand to every resident. It was the piece of evidence that moved the case from a mere property dispute into the realm of corporate malfeasance and fraud. The same day that letter arrived, a quiet, unassuming man in a gray suit checked into a modest hotel just outside Serenity Shores. His name was Ben Carter, and he was a senior partner at a law firm in San Francisco that specialized in one thing: dismantling corrupt organizations. He did not drive a fancy car or wear a flashy watch. He looked more like an accountant than a legal predator. He spent the next few days having quiet coffees with the disgruntled older residents, the ones who viewed Margaret's coup with disgust. He listened patiently to their stories. He had a disarming way of making people feel safe. And soon they were telling him everything about Margaret's tyrannical board meetings, about her vision for the house, about the whispers of financial desperation that had preceded the annexation. He then met with the landscaper Frank had hired, who confirmed the lawn had never been out of compliance. He met with the original locksmith, who confirmed the locks were a high security, custom order and not something one would neglect. Ben Carter never once mentioned Dr. Finch. He presented himself as an independent investigator looking into potential HOA fraud on behalf of a concerned group of property owners. By the end of the week, he had a stack of sworn affidavits. He had a paper trail. He had witnesses. On Friday afternoon, he sat in his hotel room and made a call. "I have everything we need," he said. "She's built her own prison and handed us the key. Are we ready to proceed?" Thousands of miles away, in a temporary base camp high in the Andes, Dr. Alastair Finch stood watching the sunset paint the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and purple. "Yes, Ben," he replied, his voice calm and steady over the satellite phone. "Initiate Phase 2. It's time to remind Miss Stillwater what happens when a petty chiefdom declares war on an empire." Margaret Stillwater was in her element. She stood on the grand terrace of what she now called the HOA clubhouse, a glass of Chardonnay in one hand, gesturing with the other toward the setting sun that bled across the Pacific horizon. Before her stood a wealthy couple, the Athertons, who were scouting locations for their daughter's wedding. "As you can see, the panoramic view is unparalleled," Margaret said, her voice smooth and practiced. "We can accommodate up to 200 guests on the lawn, with catering tents here, and the bridal party can use the entire upper floor for preparations. It's the most exclusive venue on the coast." Mr. Atherton, a man whose suit was worth more than Margaret's car, looked impressed. "It's magnificent, and you're certain it's available for our date in June?" "Absolutely," Margaret beamed. "I manage the bookings personally. It's just a matter of the deposit and signing the venue agreement." She was already calculating the commission, a management fee. Of course, that would go directly into her personal account. This house wasn't just stabilizing the HOA's finances, it was going to make her rich. It was at that precise moment of triumph that a quiet man in a nondescript gray suit walked onto the patio. It was Ben Carter. He held a thick leather briefcase. Frank Miller followed a few paces behind him, his expression unreadable. Margaret's smile tightened. "Excuse me, this is a private tour," she snapped. Recognizing Frank, "I told you not to return to this property." "Frank! And who is this?" "I'm Ben Carter," the lawyer said, his voice calm and pleasant. He offered a polite nod to the Athertons. "I apologize for the interruption, but I have some urgent legal matters to discuss with Ms. Stillwater and the other members of the Serenity Shores HOA board." Margaret let out a short, condescending laugh. "I'm sure you do. Any legal matters can be submitted in writing to the HOA office during business hours. Now, if you'll excuse us, I'm afraid this can't wait, Ben said, his tone unwavering. He placed his briefcase on a glass table and opened it. He removed not one, but 7 thick, bound documents. This one is for you, Ms. Stillwater. He handed the top one to her. She took it, her expression one of extreme annoyance. The cover sheet read Finch versus Stillwater, et al., in the Superior Court of California, County of Los Angeles. Finch, she said, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. Who is Finch? Dr. Alistair Finch, Ben clarified. The man who owns this house. The man whose property you are currently attempting to rent out for a wedding. The Athertons exchanged an alarmed look. Mr. Atherton took a subtle step back. Margaret scoffed, flipping through the first few pages. This is absurd. The property was abandoned and legally annexed under HOA bylaws. This lawsuit is frivolous. Our lawyers will have it thrown out in a week. I don't think so, Ben said, his voice losing its pleasant edge and taking on the cold, hard glint of steel. Perhaps you should turn to page 7, List of Defendants. You'll see that Dr. Finch is not just suing the HOA as an entity, he is suing you, Margaret Stillwater, personally, along with every single board member who voted for the annexation. Your personal assets, your homes, your cars, your bank accounts are all named in the injunction. Margaret's hand began to tremble slightly. She stared at her name, printed in stark black ink. This is an intimidation tactic. No, Ben corrected her. This is a consequence. Let's move on to page 12. Statement of charges. We're starting with breaking and entering, illegal seizure of property, and trespassing. We then move to conversion, for your attempts to profit from my client's property. Then there's mail fraud, for using the U.S. Postal Service to send fraudulent billing statements attributing HOA discounts to your illegal seizure. And wire fraud, for using the telephone to advertise the property for rent. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. The Athertons were now quietly inching toward the exit. But those are the lesser charges. Ms. Stillwater, the primary claim, which I believe you'll find on page 30, is a civil RICO charge. The color drained from Margaret's face. Even she knew what RICO meant. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was a law designed to take down the mob. You're accusing us of being gangsters, she whispered, her voice cracking. The law defines a racketeering enterprise as any group of individuals engaged in a continued pattern of criminal activity for financial gain, Ben stated, his voice like a judge's gavel. You conspired to illegally seize a high-value asset, converted it for profit, used that profit to manipulate community finances, and used mail and wire communications to do so. Under your leadership, the Serenity Shores HOA fits the legal definition of a corrupt organization perfectly. A successful RICO suit allows for treble damages. So we are not just suing you for the $12 million value of this house. We are suing you and your fellow board members for $36 million plus punitive damages. Margaret stared at him, her mouth agape, the legal document shaking violently in her hand. The world of bylaws and lawn regulations had vanished, replaced by the terrifying specter of federal charges and financial ruin. And just so we're clear, Ben continued, his voice relentless, this isn't a case of he said, she said. We have sworn affidavits from a dozen of your neighbors. We have Frank's detailed logs and photographs. We have your own signed letters. We have audio recordings of you calling this house a derelict property and outlining your plan to monetize it. We have everything. He gestured to the other bound volumes. These are copies for the rest of your board. I'd suggest you call them. They've probably just been served by my associates. As if on cue, Margaret's phone began to buzz frantically in her pocket. It was the board's vice president. Then another call came in, and another. A cascade of panic was tearing through her small kingdom. The Athertons had vanished. Margaret was alone on the patio with Ben and Frank. The setting sun no longer looked beautiful. It looked apocalyptic. What, what do you want? She stammered. The fight completely gone from her, replaced by a raw, primal fear. What Dr. Finch wants, Ben said, is his house back. Immediately. And he wants a clear message sent that property rights in this country are not subject to the whims of a petty tyrant with a clipboard. As he spoke, two uniformed sheriff's deputies appeared at the edge of the patio, their presence a stunning shock against the tranquil coastal backdrop. One of them held a document. Margaret Stillwater, the lead deputy asked, his voice polite but firm. She nodded numbly. We have an emergency restraining order signed by Judge Al-Hassani. The deputy said, it orders you and any associates of the Serenity Shores HOA to immediately vacate this property. You are not to come within 500 feet of it. Mr. Miller here is to be given back the keys and recognized as the sole authorized agent on site. Please gather your personal effects and leave. Her reign was over. In the space of 10 minutes, her entire empire had been dismantled. The power she had stolen, the authority she had fabricated, it all evaporated under the harsh light of actual law. The deputies stood by as Margaret, shaking and humiliated, retrieved her clipboard and mallet from inside. They were no longer symbols of her power, but artifacts of her delusion. She walked past Frank, who stood by the door, his expression unchanged. One of the deputies handed him a new set of keys. Margaret didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She walked down the long driveway, a deposed queen being exiled from her stolen castle, the $36 million lawsuit feeling heavier than any crown she had ever imagined wearing. The walk of shame down the long, winding driveway was an eternity of humiliation for Margaret Stillwater. The setting sun cast her long, distorted shadow before her, as if her own silhouette were fleeing the scene of her downfall, the gentle hum of the Pacific. Once the soundtrack to her triumph, now sounded like a low, mocking laugh. She did not look back. She could feel the weight of the deputy's professional indifference, the cold victory in Frank Miller's stoic gaze, and the invisible, crushing judgment of the $12 million house that had shrugged her off like a flea. Her phone, which had been buzzing incessantly in her pocket, had fallen silent. The panicked calls from her board members had ceased, replaced by an ominous quiet that felt even more terrifying. The rats were not just leaving the sinking ship. They were busy making deals with the man who had torpedoed it. Her world had been reduced to a single, terrifying document shaking in her hand. Finch, Stillwater, et al., and others had been her army. Now, she knew with sickening certainty, they were her executioners. The RICO charge was a death sentence. It wasn't just about money, it was a brand, a scarlet letter that would follow her for the rest of her life. Racketeer. It was a word for mobsters in pinstripe suits, not for community leaders in red ties. But Ben Carter had drawn the line between the two with horrifying precision. The moment she was off the property, sequestered in her own home, a much smaller, far less magnificent house that now felt like a prison cell, the carefully constructed facade of the Serenity Shores HOA board imploded. An emergency meeting was called, not by Margaret, but by the panicked vice president, a retired orthodontist named Gerald. They gathered not in the stolen glory of the Azure Point House, but huddled in the cramped, windowless community room like conspirators at their own trial. Ben Carter did not attend. He sent a junior associate, a young woman who did nothing but place 7 more copies of the lawsuit on the table and say, Mr. Carter will entertain a settlement offer. You have 24 hours to decide on your collective response. The board members, who had felt so powerful sipping wine on Dr. Finch's terrace, now looked at each other with the raw fear of cornered animals. They read the lawsuit in horrified silence. They saw their own names, their own assets, listed in cold, black type. They saw the sworn affidavits from their neighbors. They saw transcripts of Margaret's grandiose speeches. They saw the fraudulent billing statements they had all approved. She told us it was legal. A woman named Carol whimpered, her face pale. She said the bylaws were clear. The bylaws don't supersede state and federal law. Carol, Gerald snapped, his hands shaking. A RICO charge. My God, do you know what that means? They can freeze our accounts, my pension, my house. The consensus was immediate, brutal, and unanimous. Their loyalty to Margaret, which had always been conditional on her success, vanished in an instant. She was no longer their leader. She was the anchor chained to their necks. They had to cut the chain. The next morning, Ben Carter received a call from the board's hastily retained lawyer. They accepted the settlement. The terms were harsh, but they were a life raft. That afternoon, a formal letter, drafted by Ben Carter himself but signed by every board member, was posted in the community gatehouse and emailed to every resident. It announced the immediate and permanent resignation of the entire board. It contained a full, unequivocal public apology to Dr. Alistair Finch for the illegal and morally bankrupt actions taken against him. Crucially, it identified Margaret Stillwater, and her alone, as the sole architect of the fraudulent scheme, stating that the board had acted on false and misleading legal assurances she had provided. They had saved themselves by sacrificing her completely, leaving her utterly alone to face the full, terrifying wrath of the lawsuit. 2 days later, Dr. Alistair Finch came home. He did not arrive in a limousine or a helicopter. He arrived in a dusty, mud-splattered Land Rover that looked like it had just driven straight from the Andes. He was a tall man, leaner than one might expect, with a deeply tanned face, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and eyes that held the patient, observant calm of a man who thinks in centuries, not news cycles. He wore simple khaki trousers and a worn linen shirt. He looked less like a millionaire and more like a professor returning from a long and satisfying field expedition. Frank Miller met him at the door. There was no grand celebration, just a firm handshake and a quiet exchange. "Welcome home, Dr. Finch," Frank said, a wave of relief washing over him. "You did well, Frank," Finch replied, his eyes conveying a deep, sincere gratitude. "More than well. You were the guardian at the gate." Dr. Finch walked through his house, touching nothing, his gaze sweeping over the rooms. He was not inspecting for damage. He was reacquainting himself with his territory. Feeling the spirit of the place settle back into its rightful alignment, he stopped in front of the display case of pre-Columbian pottery. The first lesson of civilization. "Frank," he said softly, "is that the rule of law is the only thing that separates us from barbarism. When the law is forgotten or twisted for personal gain, civilization begins to rot from the inside. We just witnessed a very small, very localized rot, and we had to cut it out before it spread." That weekend, an invitation was sent to every resident of Serenity Shores. It was an invitation to a community gathering on the lawn of One Azure Point. No talk of lawsuits or bylaws, just a gathering of neighbors. Almost everyone came. They were drawn by curiosity, by relief, by a lingering sense of guilt. They stood in awkward clusters on the perfect lawn. The setting of the recent drama, Margaret Stillwater was not among them. Her house, Frank had learned, had a "for sale" sign on the lawn, the proceeds already earmarked for the army of lawyers she would need. When Dr. Finch emerged from the house and stood before them, a hush fell over the crowd. He held no clipboard, no microphone. He simply spoke, his voice carrying easily in the still evening air. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "Thank you for coming. I am Alistair Finch, and first and foremost, I want to say that this is my home, but it is also a part of your community. And it seems the definition of that word, community, has been tested lately." He looked around, making eye contact with many of them. "For the past 2 years, I have been excavating the ruins of a small but complex civilization in South America. They flourished for 500 years. They built aqueducts, temples, a society of laws, and then they vanished. We believe we know why. Their leadership began to value power over people. They turned their rules, which were designed to create order, into weapons to punish their rivals and enrich themselves. The social contract broke. The people stopped trusting the leaders, and then they stopped trusting each other. The society didn't fall to an invasion. It collapsed from within. He let the parallel hang in the air. What happened here was a microcosm of that, an attempt to use rules as weapons, a leader who valued personal gain over the well-being of the group, a community that was pushed to the brink of turning on itself. He looked toward the former board members, who were standing at the edge of the crowd, their faces etched with shame. The desire for lower dues is understandable, he said, his voice without condemnation. But it cannot come at the cost of a neighbor's property, a neighbor's rights. The law, the real law, is the bedrock we all stand on. When one person's bedrock is shattered, the ground beneath everyone becomes unstable. He then laid out his vision. The lawsuit against the former board members has been settled. The lawsuit against Mrs. Stillwater will proceed. The HOA, as it was, is dissolved. But a community needs governance. I am personally funding an independent review to be conducted by Mr. Carter's firm to help you draft a new, simpler, and fairer set of covenants. Covenants that protect property values without infringing on fundamental rights. Covenants that can never again be twisted into a weapon. He continued, furthermore, I will endow a new community trust, ensuring the HOA's finances are never again so precarious as to inspire such desperate and illegal acts. My only request is that a small, independent oversight committee, comprised of residents, is elected to manage it with full transparency. A wave of applause, hesitant at first, then thunderous, swept through the crowd. Finch had not only defeated his enemy, he had rebuilt the entire system to be better, fairer, and stronger. He had taken a crisis and turned it into an opportunity for renewal. In the end, Serenity Shores was reborn. The new HOA was a model of quiet efficiency. The community, once fractured by suspicion, began to heal. The Azure Point House remained a private residence, but its owner was no longer an absentee mystery. He was the anchor, the quiet scholar who had reminded them all of the difference between civilization and barbarism. Frank Miller was promoted to estate manager of all of Dr. Tar. Finch's properties, a title that came with a salary that allowed him to buy a small home of his own, with an ocean view. And Dr. Finch, he could often be seen sitting on his terrace in the evenings, not with a glass of wine, but with a dusty textbook, or an ancient, broken piece of pottery, staring out at the timeless Pacific. He had fought a war not for a house, but for a principle. He had seen firsthand how quickly empires, large and small, can fall, and he had, with surgical precision, saved his. After being evicted from the mansion, Margaret Stillwater's world collapsed. The HOA board members, now facing a $36 million RICO lawsuit targeting their personal assets, quickly turned on her. They accepted a deal from Dr. Finch's attorney, resigned from their positions, issue a public apology to Dr. Finch, and place full blame for the fraudulent scheme on Margaret. Isolated and staring down financial ruin, Margaret was forced to sell her home to cover mounting legal expenses. A few days later, Theodore Alistair Finch returned not as a flashy millionaire, but as a quiet, erudite scholar. He hosted a community meeting on his front lawn, where he delivered not a victory speech, but a profound address. He compared the collapse of ancient civilizations due to corruption with the small-scale crisis their community had just experienced, warning that rules weaponized against people would destroy a society from within. To resolve the issue, Dr. Finch announced he would personally fund the complete redrafting of the HOA's bylaws to ensure fairness and transparency. He also established a community trust to provide lasting financial stability. This gesture not only restored his home, but also healed and rebuilt the fractured community. Faithful caretaker Frank Miller was promoted to property manager. In the end, Dr. Finch, the scholar who had fought for principle, restored peace and order to his small empire. In the end, this wasn't just about a house, it was about drawing a line against tyranny. No matter how small, it's a chilling reminder that your home is your castle, and no HOA has the right to storm the gates. Thank you for joining us on this wild ride. If you believe in property rights, subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments what would you have done.